The film opens at a beach house on an island, introducing us to a gifted writer named Ted. Ted shares this home with his wife, Marion, and their daughter, Ruth. The walls are adorned with photographs of their late sons, Tom and Tim, who tragically lost their lives in a car accident a few years back. Since that devastating event, Marion has struggled to cope, enveloped in grief. Meanwhile, Ted immerses himself in his work, while Ruth is cared for by her babysitter, Alice. Ruth learns about the circumstances surrounding her brother's accident and often gazes at their pictures. One day, Ted hires an assistant to help with various tasks and to drive him, as his driving privileges were revoked 3 months prior. The new assistant, Eddie, soon becomes a part of their lives. Ted discusses Eddie with Marion, and they engage in a conversation that reveals the strain in their relationship since the loss of their son. Marion, still in shock, remains mostly silent. Observing the growing distance between them, Ted suggests they take a break from one another, to which Marion agrees, opting to stay at a hotel in the city. That night, Ruth experiences a terrifying dream and shares it with Ted. In an effort to comfort her, Ted tells her a story to help her drift off to sleep. Inspired by Ruth's dream, he begins to write a book based on it. The following morning, Marion arrives to pick up Eddie, who is set to start his new role as Ted's assistant. When Eddie sees Marion, he finds her strikingly attractive, and she feels a mutual attraction. Marion then takes Eddie back to Ted's house. She heads to her hotel. Meanwhile, Ted meets up with Eddie and tells him about his job. Ted also mentions something important. "You will need to stay in this house from now on." Eddie has a strong admiration for Ted. He aspires to be a talented writer like him. This is why Eddie feels so fortunate to be here. Ted shows him around the entire house. During the tour, he opens up about his deteriorating marriage. He explains that he and Marion are living apart. Next, Eddie meets Alice, who is Ruth's babysitter. She is a charming young woman. In addition to writing, Ted is also an artist. He frequently paints nude portraits of girls. Ted has also enlisted Evelyn, a woman, to be his model. The following day, Marion arrives. Eddie follows her to the theater. There, he runs into Marion. He tells her he came for dinner since he didn't bring any food from Ted's place. After hearing this, Marion responds, "One day, I want to take you out for dinner." That same night, when Eddie gets back home, he starts to pleasure himself while looking at a photo of Marion. Just then, Ted and Ruth arrive, and Eddie barely manages to hide. The next day, Marion visits again. Afterward, Eddie goes home, discovers Marion's underwear, and begins to pleasure himself once more. However, Marion walks in and catches him in the act. She apologizes to Eddie, saying she should have come by earlier. Eddie felt a wave of embarrassment after being caught in such a situation. However, Marion reassured him that she wasn't upset and that it's normal for someone his age to find themselves in similar predicaments. Eddie confesses to Marion that he has been thinking about her ever since their first meeting. Marion, taken aback by his admission, falls silent. The following day, while taking Ted to Evelyn's house, Eddie discovers that Marion has left her underwear behind. That evening, Eddie and Marion enjoy dinner together, engaging in deep conversation. Marion inquires why Eddie hasn't asked Alice out on a date. Eddie explains that Alice doesn't see him in that light. After a lengthy discussion, they both head home. The next day, Marion stops by Eddie's room to share the stories behind the pictures adorning his walls. As they flirt, they find themselves drawing closer together. The day after, Ted accompanies Eddie to a venue where he reads a book to an audience of 10. Eddie learns from Ted's narrative that all of Ted's stories are based on his own experiences. On their way home, Ted expresses gratitude to Eddie, noting that since Eddie's arrival, Marion has been happier than she has been in a long time. A few nights later, Ruth enters Marion's room and stumbles upon Eddie and Marion in a close embrace. Seeing this, Ruth begins to cry, prompting Marion to comfort her. Ted eventually discovers the affair and confronts Eddie about it while they are in the car. Ted reveals his intention to have Eddie testify against Marion and discusses his plan to secure custody of Ruth in the event of a divorce. In light of everything, Eddie questions Marion about her continued relationship with Ted. Marion explains that Ted is a wonderful parent who takes excellent care of Ruth, but she admits to disliking his painting hobby, which initially involved creating nude portraits of her. As days go by, one night, Eddie asks Marion how their children sustained their injuries. After reflecting on her deceased sons, Marion falls silent once more. That evening, while Eddie was sharing photos with Ruth, she requested to take one to her room. Marion agreed, but Ruth accidentally dropped the picture, causing the shattered glass to cut her finger. Eddie and Marion rushed her to the doctor. When Ted learns of the incident, he becomes furious with Eddie. The following day, as Marion and Eddie share a moment, she suddenly breaks down in tears. She confides in him that she intends to leave everything behind soon. On that same day, Ted asks Eddie to visit Evelyn's house and retrieve all her paintings. Ted can't shake thoughts of Evelyn from his mind. Evelyn, infuriated, demands that Ted come to see her on Friday. Meanwhile, in a moment of frustration, Evelyn accidentally slams her door shut. In response, Eddie breaks a window to enter her house. Later that evening, Marion informs Eddie that they will take Ted to Evelyn's on Friday, but won't bring him back. This plan will allow Ted to return home alone that evening. At that moment, she resolves to gather all her son's pictures and leave for good. The next day, when Eddie drops Ted off at Evelyn's, she is extremely upset. She tears up all the paintings Ted had sent her, and after leaving Ted at her house, Eddie heads back home. Marion sends Ruth to the doctor with Eddie, knowing that if Ruth stays behind, she won't be able to leave. After Ruth's stitches are removed, Eddie heads to the Photoshop to fix the broken picture. Once there, he requests the picture, understanding that Ruth would be disappointed not to see her mother in it when she returns home. However, the manager refuses to hand it over. Eddie then writes a letter explaining the situation. He shares details about his relationship with Marion, and after hearing his story, the manager agrees to provide a picture. Meanwhile, after some time, Ruth and Eddie make their way here. Ted is extremely upset with Eddie. Eddie informs Ted that Marion is gone for good, as Marion had requested him to say so. All the photographs of Marion's sons have also been removed. Now, Ted is left without any images of his son. Feeling overwhelmed with sadness, Ted confides in Eddie about his feelings that evening. This is how their children ended up in an accident. That night, the group went out to enjoy themselves, and Mary, Ted, and his two sons had been drinking. At that time, the other son was driving, despite having little experience behind the wheel. The car's headlights and taillights were buried under snow, suggesting Ted had neglected to clear them. As a result, he failed to see an oncoming truck, which collided with their vehicle on the highway, tragically taking the lives of both his sons. In an effort to cope with her grief, she gave birth to Ruth, but it did little to change her situation. After hearing this tale, Eddie feels a deep sense of remorse. Yet, he struggles to understand. How could a mother forsake her daughter? The following day, Evelyn's servant pays a visit to Ted and informs him that Evelyn has dismissed him from his position. Upon hearing this, Ted decides to hire him as a driver and assigns his wife the roles of cook and Ruth's caregiver. Afterward, Eddie bids farewell to Ted and heads home. Evelyn's servant and his wife have started to provide significant support to Ruth.